Thank you very much to everyone for joining us. For those of you who don't know WISTA, I thought I'd just do a 30-second introduction to say WISTA works with women in shipping and maritime. It promotes diversity in maritime, trading and logistics. It's empowering women to lead through their unique perspective and competencies. And we believe that gender diversity is key to a sustainable future in shipping. So that's about WISTA. We hope you're all members. If you're not, please do join us. But that's enough about WISTA. Let's move on to the meat of our conference today. We're delighted to have Pauline, who will tell us more about her current master's program a little later in the program. We're so pleased to have you here. Thank you, Pauline, for joining us. And interviewing Pauline will be our very own Helene Peter-Davies, one of two female master mariners in the market and a partner in a leading law firm in the city. So I hand you over now to the very competent hands of Helene and the very charming Pauline to conduct our proceedings today. Thank you so much, Helene and Pauline. Over to you.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today. The topic that we're going to look at starts with the apology that Lloyd's made in the media in the summer. And this announcement is where Lloyd's said in a statement with regards to the slave trade that they cannot always be proud of their past, but they apologise for the role played in the market in the 18th and 19th century with the slave trade. They have said that there's a commitment to investing in ways to recruit, retrain and develop more Black and minority ethnic market participants and provide financial support to charities and other organisations and inclusion along with other steps. So Pauline has gratefully joined us today to help us to understand a little more about the background to the apology made and where Lloyd presently rests in terms of diversity and inclusion, plus to discuss the plans that are in place and that are further being developed. So welcome, Pauline. Thank you so much for being with us. What I'd like to do just before we get on to quizzing Pauline on this is just to sort of look at Lloyd. So whilst most of you will be aware of who Lloyd's are and what they do, we thought we'd kind of set the scene. So most of you know the iconic building of Lloyd's in Lime Street, and also that they're synonymous with shipping insurance. And I've got a little video just to share. So if you just give me one moment. There we go, and hopefully hope that helped everybody to understand a little more about Lloyd's. So Pauline, what I'd like to do is start with going back to the apology and Obviously, the background to this is that Lloyd's was responsible for almost all of the marine insurance placed for the slave trade in London, and that this made up a significant amount of business to the UK generally at that time. So looking at this, within Lloyd's, how aware are people of that past role in the market? Is it a conversation that people are willing to have? And is there an acknowledgement of the historic impact, including the systemic societal legacy that comes with that?
Thank you, Helene, and good afternoon to everyone. I think it's a really interesting and loaded question, and there are so many different angles that you could start with, so that you can answer with. So let me start by saying, you know, the challenge with transatlantic slavery and the slave trade is that it was in part across a global business, that any organisation that was potentially involved in sugar, in you think of tea, rum, and shipping, will have had some involvement in, and many individuals who may have been seen as philanthropists at the time, or were potentially involved in that process as well, because that is what our history was. The challenge with the history is that it's not part of our common dialogue when we talk about historical the parts of our history that we are not proud of. So if you think about the education system, how much of that education system would you have gone through understanding and knowing about the connection of the British Empire into the slave trade and the millions of enslaved Africans that were part of that? So I think there's a real dialogue that says, generally and more broadly in society, and especially in the UK, do we have that knowledge generally? The answer is, for many people, no. And that's not a finger wagging at them as individuals. But I remember my days back in school and leaving school and thinking I didn't really get much out of that history GCSE, so I went off and did another one in Black history. That isn't an option that many people typically go and do. And I remember, because my class had 5 people in it. So it's not, and the curriculum is an optional element. So many of the schools do not have Black history or Black British history as part of their curriculum. So I think that's a part that's there. Now, generally, given the type of business that we're in, I think people will be very aware that we will have had some involvement in the slave trade. That's clear. And that is what the apology was about. So the apology was stating that if there was some, we apologise for the involvement of the Lloyd's market in the slave trade, and that's, you can't shy away from that. It's there, and that's why the apology is heartfelt in the sense, and the dialogue, in fact, was had a week or so before, when we were very clear what we wanted to say, and that if we needed to make that apology, we should.
That's excellent. So looking at the timing of the apology, it was issued this summer in a period during which the Black Lives Matter protests had started. And I think it's fair to say that the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer was instigated by the death of George Floyd, highlighted systemic failings in society which run to the British society as well as that in the US, and that a clear link is able to be made with the systemic treatment of people of colour, the slave trade, and also the wider colonialism of the British Empire. And obviously it's this imbalance which is what people are asking and requesting is being addressed. So from the outside, it appears that the announcement from Lloyd, this apology from Lloyd's, was made as a reaction to those protests. What would your response to this be?
What I'd say is that the agenda around ethnicity has been one that we have been committed to and working on for a while. That said, absolutely, there was, the death of George Floyd had people externally and, most importantly for us, internally, asking what our position was. What was our position and what were we doing around the ethnicity agenda, around supporting minority ethnic colleagues, and particularly in supporting the structural and systemic impact that creates a disadvantage, a higher disadvantage for Black people in our industry. And I think it's right that we should have therefore responded to that request. And actually it was our colleagues internally in the corporation that were really clear that they expected that from us as well. So we undertook a dialogue with our colleagues. And I recall I was on leave the week that George Floyd was killed, and I recall coming back to work that first week of June and having the dialogues. I ran some listening workshops, discussion workshops with colleagues, some for just ethnic minority colleagues and some more broadly for the organisation, the structure being the same, which was, how has this impacted you? What's your experiences and what would you like us to be doing? Because I think it's really important to give individuals a voice, and that's not just Black and minority ethnic colleagues a voice, but to give everyone a voice to be able to be part of that. And it took me a whole weekend. You can imagine running these sessions and people sharing the impact of what it felt like for them. And I recall going away for 2 days and literally just locking myself away, because actually far and wide, and people across, it was a global participation. People were saying how much it had impacted them personally. But yet what they really wanted was to know that their organisation was committed to changing in the future. If there is an impact that is disproportionately affecting Black and minority ethnic colleagues, they wanted that to be resolved. So yes, it feels as though it's reactionary, but I can promise you that actually reactionary with no clear plan is a lot worse than having a plan and stating really clearly, we've listened to our colleagues, this is what they would like, and this is what we are committed to doing. It isn't just, we stand with you, and then nothing more. And there have been lots of virtue signalling from organisations and lots of backlash because of it. What people want to know is that there is a clear plan that's going to move the dialogue forward.
And on the plan, so obviously there was a lot of reflection from Lloyd's on what you could do. So where were the, from all that sort of gathering of information, what aims and goals were considered that can help to rebalance the position that we have today, rather than looking at reparations, so to speak? We're looking at rebalancing today's position.
Absolutely. So it's really interesting. We came out with 5 different items, 5-point plan. I call it 4+1, only because we have so many 5-point plans. So I've decided it was 4 more immediate options and 1 that was about building a much more robust, longer-term plan. So firstly, it was ideas from. So 1, ideas formed from our colleagues. 2, some of the work that we had already had in train and working on. I'll just share, for those that have been in the Lloyd's building, back in 2018, actually, for Black History Month, we ran a dinner for Black and minority ethnic colleagues in the insurance sector. And we had 60 professionals come in, and just to have that image of, I remember people that were like, wow, I've never seen anything like this. To have so many Black and minority ethnic colleagues in the Adam Room having a formal seated dinner to talk about what sorts of actions, again, their experiences, and what could we do to move the dial. And some of those items are things that have, over the last 18 months, have culminated, that we've gone through. So our Ethnicity in the Workplace report that we launched in October is one of those items that follows on from that dinner. So the 4+1 plan was essentially that, number 1, that we would develop Black and minority ethnic talent. And we have launched an Accelerate programme. We started designing that programme late last year. and obviously slowed down a little bit because of the pandemic, but it is live. You'll see it on the website, although applications do close today, but we expect to see more cohorts running in next year around the Accelerate programme, and that's not about fixing our ethnic minority colleagues. That's about developing them as individuals, but also engaging with executive sponsors, engaging with their line managers, engaging with mentors. So it's a much more holistic approach to development and awareness and education for individuals, not just ethnic minorities. And it also forms part of our leadership, future leaders, alumni going forward. So you take those types of actions, is one of them. I'll rattle through the others a little bit quicker for you, because the one was looking at policies and our artifacts. I can tell you the policies work continues. Our artifacts, 3,000 artifacts, where we don't have the knowledge of who owned it. You've got a name and you've got to go back and look at that person. Got to go right the way back and determine, does that individual, was that individual involved, and what do we do with the artifact once we, it's a silver plate somewhere, or a goblet. You've got to understand all of those elements. So we're looking to partner with obviously research partners. It will be universities to help us with that, but again, slightly delayed because of the pandemic. So we expect that to kick off now in earnest next year. Education is a key theme. So from an education perspective, we absolutely believe that it's important to educate all of our colleagues. In the corporation, we've run racial literacy conversations. So conversations for individuals to just talk about it being more confident, if that's the best way to describe. But it's really tough when people are not sure whether they should have had a conversation. Should I ask? What should I say? But we've also run sessions with John Amici, who is an amazing occupational psychologist and business psychologist as well. So we've run different sessions. We've just come off the back of Black History Month, and the one call out, and I know we had this dialogue, is around, it doesn't all have to be in October. It really doesn't. It should be throughout the year, and we should be signposting and engaging dialogue and keeping this agenda on the topic. International Women's Day is in March, but we don't only talk about them in March. So it needs to be exactly the same from a minority ethnic perspective. The next was, so that was the third. Fourth was to look at charitable partners. And we have identified some small grassroots charities alongside some larger organisations that we're really interested in partnering with. And that really drives to that long-term plan. Could one of them be research-based, perhaps one from a educational and social, attacking some aspects of social mobility, but really focusing how you lift up and rise, bring up some of those key students and introduce them to our sector and our market. That's key. And then the final one, as I said, long-term plan. What are all the other things that our colleagues that we know are in train that we really need to drive? What does supplier diversity look like? Minority-owned businesses? What does what should we be doing around recruitment? What more do we need to do? So there's lots of other areas, but we want to make sure that we build those commitments based on the insights of our colleagues. And so we are conducting more research with our colleagues to understand their own lived experiences of being a Black or minority ethnic professional in Lloyd's.
Excellent. So let's have a look at what you've done over the last 5 years. So your present role is very much on looking at the key drivers for change, and that you came in with a very new remit, that Lloyd's hadn't really looked at diversity and inclusion prior to you coming in, and that you came in with a background from banking where I assume there's been very similar issues or very similar lack of focus on equalities throughout. So how would you describe your journey that has been taken to develop those areas over the last 5 years, and what are your highlights so far?
So what I will say to you is that it's the only similarity between banking and insurances is that 20 years ago they were probably where we are now, and where when I first got here. Banking is further ahead in some aspects. There is now a female, so we were a little bit ahead of the female chief exec of one of the largest banks, but certainly they have been working on this for a much longer period. So if you've come out of banking and come into insurance, it feels like we're a little bit less progressive as an industry. Gosh, it's backwards. I've heard people say that, and certainly I thought that when I sat in the reception of 1 Lime Street and for my interview, and just saw a lack of diversity, be that women, be that ethnic minorities, up and down the escalators. And you know, you're just sitting there waiting and still waiting to see if there's anybody, any diversity. And then it's like, oh, I see a pair of legs. So it's, you know, there were, so that was the obvious, I'll say the obvious shock. And Inga Beale joined, of course, bringing a huge mandate around diversity and inclusion. She was very committed to the agenda. I met her weirdly at Mansion House the year before, and you could see that this was you know, something that she was definitely passionate about driving. Didn't know I'd be you know, interviewed for a role sometime later, and then joining as the first diversity and inclusion manager for the corporation. And I think what's been really remarkable is to see the progress over the last five and a bit years that I've been there, to see the growth in terms of organisations that are starting to pay attention to this work, that are committed to having the conversations and putting resources behind the diversity and inclusion agenda. I think that's really critical. Absolutely has been really critical to make sure that we do that. The year that I joined, we launched our first Dive-In festival. We've just finished festival number 6. And I have to say, when I joined, I sort of signed the paperwork, and then they said, oh, by the way, we're going to have this festival for diversity. And it sounded like D&I week. And I've never been a big fan of diversity in 1 week, a bit like Black History in 1 month. So I sort of sat there and thought, you could have told me before I signed the paperwork. But the reality is that the festival has given us a really, you know, solid platform to build and grow the dialogue around diversity and inclusion, and not just from a gender and an ethnicity perspective, but from a family care perspective, from a social mobility perspective, by looking at neurodiversity. There are so many different elements to that. And the team this year, and I after 6 years, I've been able to step back from running the festival, and of course this year not having to run around and move chairs and get microphones out, because it was all virtual. But this year the team took the festival totally virtual in the insurance sector, and we were able to hit 30,000 participants globally. In year 5 we hit 10,000, so 35 countries and 30,000 participants at our events. Over, you know, that is phenomenal for an industry that was 5 years ago way behind the curve on this dialogue. So I think that's one of the big highlights for me. The other is the work that we're now doing to progress culture, you know, in the forward-thinking future.
Yeah. Looking at the culture of Lloyd's, obviously there's been some quite unflattering press reports describing sort of a boys' club mentality. Has this given you, were there sort of ingrained challenges to people having a cultural change within Lloyd's? And what have been the biggest challenges to sort of trying to develop a more inclusive mindset within the market?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. So yes, of course, last year, you know, shunned and thrust into the public spotlight around inappropriate behaviours, bullying, sexual harassment, not the greatest light. And I think the key there was having really bold and strong leadership. And I think John Neal, he's done that in a very, very clear, determined and authentic way. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time with John, and it's really, for me, it's really critical that the leader of the organisation is on that same page as me, that they absolutely are going to put everything they can behind making sure it moves forward. Otherwise, there's no point in me being here, because I'd be pushing, against a shut door. But the reality is that there are pockets of our culture, of our industry, where the culture is not great, and there are elements of the way in which we have always operated in the past, quite insular, quite a very sort of I did say that to someone once, that it's a really insular style. We're quite inward focused. And no, we're not. I'm like, yeah, that's exactly the point. You think we're not, but we are. It's a very protective bubble. We sort of operate in this bubble. And how do you make that bubble bigger? Or better still, break the bubble and have lots of them. So it feels very... when I first arrived, I think every CEO I met told me that they had a child that worked in the market. I think, it was quite, and a chairman along the way, and everybody knows everyone, so relationships are really critical and key. So culture is a huge challenge. Relationships and the way that we have those market relationships and how they infiltrate our businesses is an area of issue. And then that's about that, and that feeds into our career progression and our ability to diversify and create more inclusive cultures. That said, when I look across the market, during the month of over the course of this quarter, I've been working to meet with a number of different chief execs and their HRDs to talk about culture more broadly. So not just diversity and inclusion, but looking at culture in terms of how things get done in your organisation. What does the real maturity of your organisation from creating a culture that drives high performance look like? And what's the right sort of framework for you to measure? And I've just finished my last one for the day today, but I have 33 of them planned already in the diary. I suspect by the end of the year we'll have hit 40 to 45, and the target is to get through the first 75, hopefully by the end of Jan. So I do a lot of talking with them, but what has been really positive is, one, the chief exec themselves is there. So it is chief execs from various organisations, brokers and managing agents alike, that are keen to understand the dialogue and to talk about either, not just to talk about what they're doing, hey, look at us, but also to talk about what more they could be doing and how they can gain and drive the dialogue. And that includes, and many of them quite positively, I hear them talking about setting ethnicity targets for the future, looking at their gender balance, and how they drive and develop, sort of gender parity in their organisations. So I think there's some real positive messages coming from them. They realise that some of them are at the start of the journey, but there is definitely commitment and solid commitment at the top of those organisations to see change through.
That's really interesting. It's interesting that they are sort of looking at being able to measure and benchmark what's happening. And I've seen that you've got the Holding Up the Mirror reports, which I believe started, is that 2017 they started?
Yeah.
How has that worked? Has that sort of focused people's minds a little more? And, especially your sort of the scorecards that you have, which seem to sort of, address the difficult questions of who's there, why are they there, are they getting supported, can we bring more people in effectively?
Yeah, so I think, so when we set up Holding Up the Mirror, and it was, after my first year, I sort of went, it's really important that we talk about what we have done. We need to hold up a little bit of a reflection. So yes, some of the positive work that's happening, but also in the very first report, we ran a sort of research survey with we interviewed many of the HRDs to understand what the position was. And so we've been able to track over 5 years the progress, i.e. diversity inclusion committees in place, or they've got a policy, they've got a sponsor for this work. So really tracking the progression from that perspective. I'd say that the feedback has always been very positive with Holding Up the Mirror, and it was driven through our inclusion at Lloyd's governance group that looks at diversity and inclusion in the market. the other side of that is the culture dashboard that we now have in place that really gives you that insight into some of the drivers of culture, but also that gives you insight into the representation of our market. So I think the two together are both very powerful. The culture dashboard giving us those accountability measures and metrics that we can hold ourselves accountable to, that individual firms can compare themselves to, and actually, because it's public, that people outside of our sector can hold us accountable to and determine whether we are an industry that is keen to drive progress and make progress, and can see that transformation over time, because otherwise how are we going to bring the best and brightest talent into our sector?
That's the exact point, isn't it? It's making sure that you've got the biggest pool to sort of fish from, so to speak, for your talent. So all of this work, does it feel as though the managers and the CEOs are accepting, and they're understanding that, you know, opening the doors to diversity and to making things more equal? Is it do they say that there's a benefit that they are actually getting, you know, still higher caliber people, and nobody's being excluded by ensuring that there's a bigger viewpoint put out there to who can join and be part of?
So I think I wouldn't paint it all so rosy. I would say that there is some really positive support from our chief execs, chairmans, and some of our senior leaders. I think that is the case, that we are starting to see that move, not least because there is regulatory pressures, there's external public pressures, and that this sentiment and the you know, the social acceptance of the types of behaviours, what's socially acceptable, is very out there now, and what's not acceptable. So I think that there are lots of different pressure points that says you need to sit up and take notice. Look at the legal action, look at the negative press that comes along from being, you know, having your own #MeToo moment. So I think that there are some real drivers when people consider it from a risk perspective, and we are in the risk business. So, you know, when you think about risk, think about what your ex-CEO on the front page of the Times or the Financial Times or whatever, think about what that does for your business. So there are lots of elements that people will consider, and so I think it has made boards and chief execs and executive teams and senior leaders start to take notice. That said, that message has to filter down into the middle population. It really has to filter down to the people that are hiring, developing, and the reason why people leave organisations. So we need to make sure that there doesn't become a disconnect between our senior executives' ambitions, because let's consider chief exec who's been in the industry for 30 years. Yeah, that means probably for the last 20 they haven't been down there in the ranks with people. So they believe, and I've seen, you know, I've had these dialogues with some of our you know, CEOs and chairs, you know, they often believe that this just doesn't happen anymore. You know, the reality is that the article that was released by Bloomberg, you know, I met some of those women. I met them, I've had dialogue with them, I know what their story is, and it does happen. It's pockets, it's not our whole, it's not the whole industry, but it does. I've dialogued with many ethnic minority colleagues in our market, and it, you know, the reality is that, you know, you come in and think that it takes months for you to see somebody in the underwriting room sitting in a box who happens to be black or minority ethnic. I mean, that's just ludicrous. And you cannot tell me that everybody has an equal chance. It's meritocratic that everybody has an equal chance to get in when there is not one single person in a role or seniority, you know, or in the underwriting room that you can find regularly sitting there. I'd go through there when we were there every day, 2-3 times a day.
Yeah.
Took 6 months for me to find a black person.
That's terrible. Yeah. And that brings me on to the point of like shattering the sort of recruiting in your own image, which certainly, you know, it's something which I think all of us that work within the city, we see quite often. You know, obviously on a women's perspective, there's certainly not a great deal of women within shipping, and certainly we're not seeing a great deal of Black and ethnic minority people within the city. So do you think is that a dialogue which is happening within the efforts that you're making? You know, is there a sort of a express sort of viewpoint taken on sort of ensuring that people have the skills rather than they look the part, so to speak?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So one of the challenges we have from a recruitment perspective in our industry, not just our organisation, but in many of our industries, is the fact that the reliance on the market relationships, who you know. So it's not just recruiting in the own image, it's who you know, who vouches for you. And, you know, to have a dialogue with, you know, for my research project, I interviewed a number of people, underwriters, active underwriters, you know, brokers, etc. And, you know, I remember a couple of them sort of saying, yeah, well, you know, I've got this position, so what I'll do is I'll go and ask, you know, some of my brokers and ask them who they know that might be good. I'm like, under what basis? Yeah, under what basis does that constitute good? And why are they so valuable in terms of their recommendation for somebody to move into a position or to be promoted into a position? Why would you value them? Because you drink in the pub together, because maybe you socialise together, they're godmother, godfather to your child. Otherwise, you know, this crossover between what is a business decision and making sure that you have given a fair and unbiased approach, structured, fair, unbiased, transparent recruiting process has to be addressed by organisations. That's not to say you shouldn't have the relationships with people, absolutely, but they shouldn't infiltrate on some of those core decisions in those people aspects, especially in the recruitment. So I think there are some real areas of challenge and focus that we need to hold ourselves accountable to.
Definitely. With that and the things that you've learned over the last 5 years, what tips would you give us for our businesses on achieving or moving towards having a more a better policies and a better buy-in to diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would do is, you know, my first question is always, do we think we have an issue? And I think there's an element, so you can talk about diversity is good for business. You can take the messages around McKinsey, for example. They've done 10 plus years of research. There is so much research out there. Lloyd Davis had, of course, put out his Women on Boards report, the Hampton-Alexander, which has followed that up, the Parker Review, Ruby McGregor-Smith's Race at Work review. There are so many pieces of research. Even the CBI put a report out. All of the research points are very, very clear. That and actually just yesterday, because you know clearly my you can imagine my bookshelf and my hit list of websites and videos, and I was watching a 2-minute not even 2 minutes, I think it was about 90-second video on the Equality and Human Rights Commission website. Do feel free to pop on there and look it up on ethnicity, literally stating some of the very core stats. And so I think it is important that if you're talking to your businesses, use some of those stats. You cannot argue with proven research, but I also encourage you not to focus on stats on just one strand, because the reality is that diversity and inclusion is much broader than just looking at gender, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. It's got to be broader than that. And actually, you know, I look at me and I go, well, I'm black and I'm a woman. I'm not or. So, you know, those are two things that go hand in hand for me. And that's just, so it's important that you look at other things. But to that point, dyslexia, neurodiversity, considering other aspects of diversity and inclusion, and also from a social mobility perspective. There are many people actually in our market right now that have experiences of coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and that have worked really hard and really progressed their careers, and actually want to create a more equal opportunity for others that come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So I think there is we sometimes do ourselves a disservice by focusing on one or two topics. And when you are talking to your senior leaders, the more that you can talk more broadly about tapping into all of those experiences. Men, the times have changed. Men want to be involved in raising their children and having time with their children. And actually, if organisations provided slightly better paternity packages above the government's 2 weeks, that they would be able to have more of that bonding time, as an example. So when we looked at it we looked at family care packages for our organisation. In the corporation, we offer 6 full months paid leave for anyone who starts a family, regardless of how they start a family. And so, and that saw, our chief risk officer, I recall when, he took 4 months, and taking that time and then talking about it is really important. So it's those types of things that I think are really valuable for you to showcase. So one is data points. Use data points, but use broad data points. Tap into some of the individuals in your organisations who might be able to share some of their experiences, or to be able to give a little bit more of the, oh, that's a good guy, didn't know that about them. There's that aspect. I think that's really key. And because we are in financial services, and I've been in FS now for a while, although yes, of course it was banking, and I mean, investment bankers are hugely competitive. I don't think that's any different in our sector, because actually what I noticed is that many of the chief execs, as someone asked me this week, so which of the other managing agents are doing really well? What's this, who can we learn from? Are we doing better than others? So there is a little bit that is useful for you to be able to showcase what other organisations are doing that are parallel, sort of a very closely designed structure style to yours. And I've seen some huge changes. You can see the passion with colleagues when their organisations are behind them and moving the dial. So I would give that as the sort of the wide landscape of how you can address it.
That's really wonderful. Thank you so much, Pauline. I'm just going to give a little summary, and then we can go out to some questions, if that's okay. So I think it's fair to say that it's important to acknowledge the horrors of the past and the echoes that live on by way of negative legacies in society. While the past can't be changed, we need a clear acknowledgement that historic actions continue to create imbalances in society for Black and ethnic people, and that's an important acknowledgement that we need to make. Lloyd, and the work that you're doing, Pauline, is you're ensuring that you're tackling this question of equality and accepting the realities and placing plans in place to create a more diverse and inclusive business, and that's to be applauded. So thank you. So I'll pass over to Monica now for questions.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you so much, Pauline. We have a quick question. We have not a quick question, actually. We have a very detailed question from Julie. Julie's online. I was wondering whether she could unmute and ask the question herself. Julie, are you around? Are you happy to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Really?
I have I find it very difficult to frame my answer without kind of losing my mind, when we all know that there's an issue, whether it's an ethnicity issue or whether it's a gender issue or whatever, and you just face somebody in maritime who tells you it's not there. It's really hard to deal with it. And I was really in admiration of Helene dealing with somebody I'd call a troll just about a week or two ago on LinkedIn. So how do you, when you're in Lloyd's or in a previous job, how do you say to them, how do you talk to them politely and say, look, your lived experience may be that you don't see it, but it exists, and when you say it's not an issue, you belittle it? How do we have those conversations, or do you just have to battle it out? Because oh, what have I done? Have I broken the internet with my question?
I think Pauline just left, but it's fine. She'll come back and she will answer you.
Oh, there we are.
And she's muted, so she just needs to unmute.
I'm here. I think it's battery. Give me 1 second.
Yeah. No, I do find this question very interesting, Julie, because we all face it, and especially when it's you know, not a woman and not a colored woman asking you, telling you, actually not just asking you, telling you, yeah, but you're wrong. That's not true. So, Pauline?
Yeah.
I did catch the question, Julie. I thought it was a really interesting one because it's a bit like when people say to you, I don't look at colour, I hire the best person. And you know, there's an element that says, well, if you're only hiring the best person, you're not seeing, if you don't look at colour, you don't see me. Because I can tell you now, when I look in the mirror every single day, it's black and I'm a woman. So if you don't see me, I don't look at gender, I just hire the best person. This is not about equality. Equality has been there for years. This is about equity. This is about creating an equitable starting position for everyone. And to do that, you have to look at the disadvantages for different groups. And that would be the same, you know, sometimes you have to use a different starting point to be able to make that case very clear. So an equitable starting point, let's use the Lloyd's building, yeah? It cannot be equitable, you know, equals fine, everybody can apply. But if I'm a wheelchair user and we haven't made adjustments to the building in the last few years, you're going to really struggle to get into that building. You're going to really struggle to get on the underwriting room. That is not about equality. We've got to create some additional aspects. We've got to put ramps in place for somebody that has a mobility impairment in order to make it more accessible for them. That is what we are talking about. So I think you have to be able to show different elements to that, and talk about why is it therefore that across our, you know, that we have organisations that have all male boards or all male executive teams, or are we quite simply saying that women are not good enough? Because that is what if you're saying it's meritocratic and that only the best rises to the top, then you are simply saying that men are more superior and better than women.
Yeah, thank you.
Minority, or somebody from a lower socioeconomic background, etc. So I think you have to make that position very clear. Is it equitable?
Julie, anything further? Yeah, she's happy with that.
Big thumbs up.
Yeah, she's happy with that. Yeah, I do find that conversation very difficult. So thank you. I'm going to try and remember this every single time and hope I'm able to get the message across. Anybody else who has a question, do unmute. But before that, Pauline, I had a question about the artifacts. I found that very, very interesting. All the 4.1 that you're doing. But the artifacts, is there something in particular that you've noticed while going through the 13 artifacts that was not expected, or that would be interesting to talk about?
We're yet to go through them. I can tell you that we did have, so we've had a couple of things. We had our Lloyd's Japan noted that they had a silver plate that has been removed. We noted that on our website there were references to a couple of individuals, and when you look at our timeline, sort of historical timeline and historical people, and again we've removed them for sake that what we really need to do is to go through a real sort of research-based approach. So we are yet to go through all of those. So 3,000 artifacts we have not touched yet. We were able to do some immediate pieces because people were either very quick to identify or spot, some of them from our colleagues, going, hey, you did this, and this is what's great. You've made this point, but you haven't removed that reference yet, and I've looked that person up, and it's okay for that to happen. And you know what? We take swift action and we remove it and we apologise and we ask them to continue to keep us in check.
So where are the artifacts currently lying? Are they all displayed somewhere, or?
I think they're in like some sort of basement.
Okay.
Basement and in storage. So in the underwriting room, actually, you'll recall that we removed, like Nelson's collection, for example. A lot of that was removed. This is before the Black Lives Matter protest. This was some time ago when we changed the underwriting room. We had more sort of stand-up pods. And a lot of that was moved and placed back into storage. And some of the artifacts only come out when we go out and open a new office, for example, and Bob D, the head waiter, goes off and takes, you know, pictures or different pieces around. So they're in storage essentially. And it is for us to go and look at them. You know, on gallery 11, when you walk in, to the into the main reception, there used to be a series of cartoon pictures. I have to say, in 5 years of being at Lloyd's, I never looked at them, never read the commentary at the bottom of the cartoon. And I think it's because when I've looked at the pictures, I'd focused on the Caneo pictures, which are in the Adams room and in the Adam room and outside near the sort of staircase. So I looked at those pictures because I was, you know, I'd talk to people and I'd point out, you can see there are no women or so forth. Never looked at the little pictures around the corner, and there were about 20 of them. And then one day somebody flagged and said, you know, those pictures are such so derogatory towards women. I literally dropped everything, jumped in the lift and ran upstairs. And I took pictures of them because I was sitting there going, I can't believe I haven't seen them. It's so easy for us to not see. It's so easy for it to you know, just be something that you just don't notice, and sometimes people have to open your eyes to them, but we took them down. The replacement isn't as great. It's not very colourful, but we probably need some new images, and I'm sure that will come.
We have a lot of new young talent, so I'm sure they'll come up very soon. And
absolutely.
I look forward to the Lloyd Library also with the 3,000.
Oh, do you know, the more events I put in there where I put like loads of black people in there, and then there'll be like, you know, we've done several now. We've done, I remember we launched an initiative with an organisation. They said, gosh, we think this is just amazing. Like, we're here talking about race and ethnicity. And then when you look around the room, it's just all old white men. Because it's part of the history, isn't it? But the point of history is that it's a place of reference. It's a place from which we can learn and we can grow. We don't have to live in the past. It's a place of reference. So I think that that's really important. And that's why, you know, if you go full circle back to that education question at the beginning, we need to be able to understand our history, to recognise the structural elements, how it's then fed through over time. Just consider that if you are black, and I remember this in my very, very early days, and it's just unfortunate in D&I, and it's just unfortunate that the position is still very much the same. So for you, if you are black, you are more likely to be stopped by the police. You're more likely to be detained, more likely to be arrested, charged and arrested, more likely to be followed through in the CPS process and appear in court, more likely to be found guilty, more likely to serve a prison sentence, to be a custodial sentence, and then on release, more likely to reoffend because of the lack of support. All of those elements, think about how many different people are involved in that process. In England and Wales, you are talking about 5% of the workforce being black. You know, consider all of the different people. That's police, that's judges, that's the solicitors, that's the, you know, the probation office system that supports offenders, all of those elements. And that's just one angle. That is structural. That is what we are talking about when we talk about systematic and structural elements of our society that impacts and disproportionately impacts black and minority ethnic people.
So having the structure reflect society in a way. So if you have 5% representation in solicitors and judiciary and police, that you're saying makes a difference, and that's what we need to aim for, maybe?
What I'm saying is I would question. So I think there's a really interesting piece that you have to question why it is not more balanced in different parts of our structure. So why are there not more ethnic minority police officers, for example? Why are there not more, when we look at the cabinet, and it is not good enough to simply say, well, BAME, that is not a reasonable categorization, because it equalizes Black, Asian, mixed ethnicity, and people of other ethnic groups under one mass category. That is not, that doesn't help. There is a great site, I'll find it and pop it in the chat, maybe you can circulate it around. It's the power of, it's a list that was compiled that shows you the ethnicity of all of the key power structures. You can find it from the Green Park website. Green Park is a recruitment agency that has set this group up, this research piece up, and they've looked at all of those positions, looking at our cabinet, for example. So when asked, why haven't you got any Black people in the cabinet? And then you go, oh, we've got Priti. Well, actually, no, and we've got Rishi. Like, well, no, they're Asian. Like, it's not good enough to just combine everyone and pop them in one and think that we're there. The reality is we don't reflect society in some of the positions where decisions and positions of power are made. So I think that's one of the areas of focus.
Yeah. So from the top, everywhere you need to see the reflection. Yeah, I do agree. But it would be great, Pauline, if you could give us a link of even the books you referred to in the beginning and some of the websites you referred to. We would be very happy to circulate it among our membership and, you know, have everyone look at it. So we'd be delighted with that if that's something that's possible.
Absolutely. Certainly, I absolutely encourage. I really like Renee Edo-Lodge, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Really brilliant book. I like it probably more so because it's a really simple, it's very, very British orientated, but there are lots of books out there. I am reading Me and White Supremacy. People did laugh when I said I was reading it, but that's one that I'm reading as well, Layla Saeed. So I think there are definitely some, you know, books. Self-education is really critical and I think really important for you to consider. And the website I was referring to is called thecolorofpower.com.
Perfect. I think we have one more question for you. Would you like to unmute? Great.
Hi. This is Maitane. So, well, first of all, thank you, Pauline, because I think that maybe it's the first time that I see someone addressing this directly, like without no fear, like saying, look, this is how it is, and this is how we are working on it. So thank you so much for that. Later as well, I just noticed that you said, okay, the first question is that we need to answer is that okay, do we have an issue? Yes or no? Yes. So if we later, the second approach, I think, is like, okay, we have an issue and we just need to be aware of our privilege. So I think that privilege is something that is directly to be addressed. And this goes with my question, because at some point, I've been working somehow in my past experiences with some gender questions, okay? So we had this discussion about, okay, when you're discussing about gender, do we need first just the woman, so directly the person that we are affected by this issue, have like a smaller group in order to set our thoughts, to feel comfortable of what we are thinking, like without barriers, and later when we have this more or less sorted out, do we need to raise this with a diversity group in order to listen and to discuss further? What are your thoughts about how do we need to address all these discussions and so on?
So if I think what I would suggest in that dialogue, so I think, yes, it is important to understand what the issues are that you particularly feel that you are facing as a underrepresented group. And that would be the same for any underrepresented group. I think it's really important to do so. And I think that you also have to understand how you engage with those that are in the majority group. So it's useful to understand what your challenges are, for example, as a group of women who do not feel represented, where you feel those blockers and barriers are. But in order to enact change, you have to bring the broader population into that conversation. So you have to have a conversation also with the men. How can they support? Do they see the same challenges? How do you both approach opportunities for promotion, etc.? Because you'll find that there will be differences, and that may also lead you to some of the answers of what do we therefore need to do. I'll give you one final example. In a previous organisation, we recognised that people were unaware of the promotion process. Now, it's a slightly larger organisation, so there was a structured process for moving into senior vice president positions. And therefore, the women were very clear that they wanted to be able to have that, share that information and share that example, share the dialogue of how to get there. When they ran the session and they opened their session for everyone, 70% of the participants were men, because men were really clear that they wanted to understand how they get to where they want to get to next. But the dialogue didn't work with women, because they sort of sit back and go, well, when I've got when I can tick off all 10 of the options that are on the criteria for senior vice president, I'll come to the workshop then. Yeah. Whereas men are like, well, do you know what? I've got 6 of them, so let me get in there. So I think there's a real, you have to be able to have the dialogue with everyone. You have to be able to understand the perspective. So where it is, that doesn't mean, so when we look at ethnic minority experiences, we're not trying to then go, well, what's the experiences of the white population? We're not diminishing experiences. We're simply saying you have to understand it, but to change it, you have to bring everyone. I'll leave that there.
Perfect. Thank you, Pauline. I know we've kept you longer than we wanted to, but we've loved having you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We've loved hearing about, your experiences around the apology, your background, your success with the Dive-In Festival. Congratulations, really well done. Thank you so much for telling us about going to facts before we do anything, using broad data points, using the equitable model. I really think that that's something we should always remember to bring forward, and the broader planes of reference that you've given us. We will wait for your references. We've really enjoyed that. Thank you so much, Helene. I mean, you've done an amazing job of getting all of this together, working behind the scenes, along with Gisela and Pauline to, give us this insight. To everyone who joined us, thank you so much. I know Black History Month, as Pauline said, should continue through the year. So we are delighted that, we can do it in November, and hopefully we'll keep this going next year also, maybe October, maybe September next year, but we will be here with you. Please do join us at all our future conferences, future seminars. Thank you very much for being here with us. And for now, goodbye from me, Monica, the co-president of WISTA UK. Helene, Pauline, any last words? Others, we can say goodbye.
No, thank you very much, and goodbye. Have a great weekend.
Thanks to everybody. Bye.